Our ultimate goal is to create this page after a number of lessons. The first lesson, we're going to actually just use grids to create a basic layout that gives us a header, a nav bar, and then this content area. Even though we won't insert any pictures, we're going to go ahead and get the pictures copied to our own folder. So right now, if you would go to the File Explorer and then in the M drive, under Web Design, there's a folder called Grids. So either right-click, copy it, or do a Control C and then paste this into your own folder so that you have this version. And you're going to have images. There's going to be some body text that you'll be able to use. And this is where we will save this website that we start creating now. The next thing I'd like you to do is go ahead and open up Carrot and open your template. So find that template, and we're going to title this Roar Bike Grid Practice or something close to that. And then inside the body tags, we're going to start with creating the content. And so we're going to create a number of divs, and you've worked with those a little bit in Code Academy. And so basically it's just a container unit where we're going to have sections. So we're going to have a div for the header, a div for the nav, and so on. So to start out, we want to have a wrapper that goes around everything. So that div is going to be just given a class style called grid. So let's type div. And we could end there, but we're going to name it class. And then in quotes, we're going to type grid. And everything is going to go inside of this. So we're going to enter a few times. And I'm going to go back up here right below that opening of that grid. And now I'm going to put a next one in. And notice it's indented because this is the next level that's nested inside of that main wrapper div called grid. So we're going to do this one as another class style, and we'll call it header. And this one we will put some text in there so we can have a placeholder at least. And we'll just keep going. This one will be called nav, and I'm just using the arrow key to move over when I finish that div. If you want to use copy paste instead of retyping, that's fine as well. The next one's going to be called side 1, side 2. And notice once we save this, you'll see that everything that's in black right here, that's what you're going to actually see on your page. Everything else is just part of our code. The last one we're going to do for right now is going to be called main. And I'm going to remove some of those extra spaces. While we're here, I am going to label this because as we start to get more content, this closing div might get lost. So we're going to put in a comment that just says grid closing div is here. Go ahead and save this. So we're going to do a file save as, so we can save it as a new name. And I would like you to find that grid folder. So mine is actually called Roar. Yours is the grid one that you just copied. And then you can give this whatever name you would like. I'm going to call this grid practice 1. I'm going to just put a B after that, only because I already have a 1 and a 1a.html. However you want to name it, as long as you do the HTML. Click Save. And then let's just open that up. So if I go to Recent, view what that looks like. And you'll see that right now, it's just text. We haven't done anything to format this. So go back to Carrot. And now we're going to start adding in some styles. So to do that, we need to create the style tag, and notice where I place this. So it's right after the closing title, before the closing of the head section. And these are going to be internal styles. We could do this as an external style sheet, but just to keep it simple, we're going to keep one document going where we have both our main content and our styles. So the first one, we're just going to give these some background colors. And so we're going to label each of these. And because they're class styles, the selector that we use is going to have a period in front of it, and it represents the name. So we're going to do period header. And so the period represents the class style, and then the header represents the name you see here in quotes. So we'll do that for header. Then you need your 2 curly brackets. And then I'm going to back into that and enter down. And I'm just going to say background color, and you can pick whatever color you want for right now. Okay. Keep doing that same thing for the rest of them. So I'm going to enter down after that curly bracket, and I'm going to put a period in for nav. And again, period represents that it's a class style. Nav is what is in the quotes. Do the curly brackets, use the arrow to back in and enter down. And again, background color, and whatever color you want to make it. If you want to keep copying and pasting this, you can do that. So I can copy that whole section, enter down and paste, and I would just change nav to side 1. And I would just pick a different color. So I'll pick yellow, and I'll paste again, change that to side 2, or change the color blue to green. And again, at this point, it doesn't matter what colors you use. And the last one was main. And I'll do teal. Okay. I'm going to do a Control S, and I'm just going to refresh this so you can kind of see this is what it's currently looking like. And one thing I noticed, so it's just taking up the height of the text, but also notice that there's these margins going around. We're going to make a change for that. So going back to Caret, at the very top, we're going to do a universal selector that just applies to everything within the page, and that's by starting it out with an asterisk. And we put the curly brackets in again, and we just write in margin colon 0px. That's going to change the entire body margin. So I'm going to save it. Now when I refresh it, notice how we got rid of that extra space. The next step is to actually turn this into a grid layout like what we see over here. So we've got a little bit of work we need to do. One of the methods that I like for doing a grid is where we actually just have grid areas. And so we're going to define each of these areas. Even though they have a class style, we're going to define it as a grid area. And the name you give this doesn't really matter. I'm essentially naming it the same exact thing that you see here. So for each one of these, I'm going to say grid area colon, and then whatever it has been named. So the next one would be grid area colon nav. Next one is grid area colon side 1. Don't forget those semicolons. Those will mess you up if you miss them. Okay, so we have that. We now need to add some rules just for this grid that everything is in. So this right here. And I like to keep things kind of in order so we keep the code clean and we can easily find it. So notice I've placed everything in order that you see it down below in the body section. So because the grid is one of the first things we see, we're going to go back and put that up at the top. So I'm putting it in right after the closing of that universal selector. So I'm going to do period grid in my curly brackets. And the first thing we have to do is we have to define this as a grid. So we're going to say display colon grid. Then one of the things we need to do is we have to say what those areas are. So I'm going to say grid template areas. And now all these areas correspond with the areas you've defined here. So as we look at this, you can see we essentially have, we could say 2 columns. Some might say we have 3 columns, but I'm just going to keep it simple and say we have 2. And so this header has to span across those 2 columns. The nav bar has to span across 2 columns. And then we're going to have to define the width for these other columns. So what we're going to do to get this to look like that is go back to Caret, and we're going to put quotes, and we're going to go row by row. So the first row is going to say header, header, because we have to have that header repeat twice. Okay. After that quote, you enter again, and we're going to say nav, nav. Then we're going to do side, oops, I need to add the quote, side 1, and then main. Okay, we're calling this one side 1, this main, this side 2, and this main. So, and then the last one is side 2, and then main. I'm going to see quickly what we have so far on this one. And so I saved it, and you can kind of see we're making some progress. Okay, we're still a ways away from it looking how we want, but you can see how side 1, side 2, and then main, how they've stacked themselves and are starting to take form. So now we want to go back and we want to define, okay, what do we have for columns? What are we going to have for rows? So one of our options, and I can put this in, let me put the semicolon there. I'm going to go in right after the grid, just to place this ahead of the grid areas that I've defined. And we want to define our columns by saying grid template columns. And you can tell that this column is smaller, so we're going to say, we're going to do 300 px, 800 px. And then we're going to do the same thing or something similar for the rows. It's grid template rows. And this is where we can then define the height. So if I go in, an easy thing, I want these all to be similar for right now. I can just say repeat, do 4 rows because I have 4 rows going on right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, comma, and I'm going to say 100 pixels for each of those, and then put my semicolon after that. Save it, and then refresh. So you can see we're getting closer. Now a little trick to center this. So if I go back to Caret, if I put in front of, so in my columns, I'm going to actually make 4 columns. And I'm going to put 1 FR before this, and then 1 FR after. And that stands for 1 fraction. And so what's going to happen eventually, I'm going to add in some spaces. So right now it just kind of shrinks it is all that happens. But I'm going to put in a period and then a space. And that period represents a blank area where there is nothing in the grid besides white space. So there's no header or nav or anything like that. So I place the period, a space, then header, space, then header again, space, and then period. So we're going to repeat that. So I'm going to do that for each one of these. You're going to have a period to start it and a period to end, but be sure to separate that period. If it connects to what you're doing, it will not represent a white space. Once you have that, save it and see if you did it correctly. If you did it, you should now have equal white space, and the inside here is essentially taking up a total of 1100 pixels because that's the 300 plus the 800, and whatever's left, depending on what your computer resolution is, will be equal amounts on the side.